Okay, let's get started with another Chazara shiur. We're in volume 18, the second Chazara shiur for volume 18. This will be a shiur reviewing the Isurei D'Rabbanan of Bishul of Hilchot Shabbos, Shehiayh, Hachzarah, and Hatmana. Shiur number 3, 4, and 5. In this volume, we discussed the Bishul Daraisa, the last review shiur, and now we're going to discuss the three D'Rabbanans of Shehiayh, Hachzarah, and Hatmana. And again, as we have said, we're not going to go through every little detail again that we did the first time, but try to get the highlights of these three very important topics that come up every single Shabbos in almost, if not every home of Shomrei Shabbos individuals. So, in general, Shehiyah is the halachas of how to leave food on a flame before Shabbos. Hachzarah is how to put it on heat sources on Shabbos, and Hatmana applies to both insulation of food before Shabbos, insulation of food on Shabbos. So Shehiyah, starting with page 119, this is in shiur number 3 in the volume. So Shehiyah, is based on the Gzeira of Shehiayh. Shehiayh b'gechalim. If I leave food on a heat source before Shabbos in a regular way, I might come to stoke the flame, stoke the coals on Friday night to make it cook even faster. So I have to do something to remind me that it is Shabbos and I won't come to stoke. And that is why we have a concept of covering the coals, sweeping the coals, garifakatum as it's called, covering them with cool ash. That was done in the days of old, or sweeping them out. And there is a major machlokas between Hananya and the Rabbanan, quoted in the beginning of Parakira, the third parak of Shabbos. When does Shehiyah apply? When do you need a prevention? Reminder. So Hananya says once something is machlo ben drusai, once something is edible, we'll see later on, a third or a half cooked, then it's all mutter. Then we're not worried that you're going to come to stoke the coals, and therefore you can leave it on an open flame from before Shabbos. That's Shita of Hananya. And the Rabbanan say no. The Rabbanan say that as long as it's getting better, even past fully cooked, even past mavusha called sarcho, if it's mitztamik v'yafalo, if it's getting better as it stays on the heat source, which the chara always applies, or else you take it off the heat source, you don't want it to burn. So then you still need a covered flame from before Shabbos. This is a machlokas tanoim, and it's a machlokas rishonim. What we paskin, Rashi and Tosfos in a few places. Rashi in source number 4 on page 124 holds Adechananya Samchinan. We paskin Lakul like Hananya. The Rush says we paskin like Hananya. The Rambam and others paskin like the Rabbanan. That as long as it's still, even if it's fully cooked, if it's misamik v'yafalo, you still need to cover it. What is the halacha? So if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, both days are quoted, but it seems like the Shulchan Aruch in Reish and Gimel, Sifal of Paskin like the Rabbanan. Paskin like the Rabbanan lechumra. That's what it sounds like. In source number 7, in Reish and Gimel Aleph, also litain ala tafsham ibod yom lahashosu aleha elam kein espashal kol tzarcho v'mistabik v'ralo. Delek l'mecha Shehiayh. That's the only time that you might not come to stoke the coals, but if it's getting better, we are still nervous. And the Ramah paskins like the Shita of Hananya. And the Ramah says, V'nagu l'hakil k'svara achrona. The minhag is like the svara ha'achrona. And the Bir Halacha there quotes the language of the Rush. Hanach lahem, leave Klal Yisrael alone. They're aduk ba'onik Shabbos, and therefore you don't have to be so machmer on them. So there are those that say, the Chazon others, that even the Ramah, even based on the Rush, is like, well, it's still a b'diavad. It's hanach lahem is lashon, but others say no. The Ramah is a kula. The Ramah is a kula, and therefore you can pass on like Hananya me'ikir adin. So that's what Ashkenazim seem to pass like Hananya me'ikir adin. Even Sfardim, the Shulchan Aruch might have been choser bo. The Shulchan Aruch in Reish Nun Daled talks about peiros shene'echal and chayim, raw fruit, muter litnem saviv akadir. You can put them around the pot. They're not going to get fully ready. And you have a picture there on page 127 about food around the pot. So there are those that say that he was choser bo. The Yalkut Yosef says the Shulchan Aruch was choser bo, and even he passes like Hananya me'ikar hadin. But others say no. There it's not on top of, it's next to. So it's known as a machlokas Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. But either way, even Ashkenazim l'chadchila, we try to fulfill the shita of the Rabbanan, and therefore, even if something is fully cooked, we try l'chadchila to never leave something on an open fire from before Shabbos if it's possible to cover. And that's what the Shmir Shabbos says in source number 13. Tov lahakbet shekol tafshil yimavusha kol tzarcha be'erev Shabbos. It should be fully cooked. Visha hakadera tinatin al gabe ish mechusa, and that the pot is put on a covered flame lefnei knisas hashabbos. There is a kula built into Shehiyah, and that's a kedera chaisa, a piece of raw food. The Gemara talks about if I put in a piece of raw food right before Shabbos, that basically represents a hesach hadas. I'm not going to think about this, and of course I'm not going to come to stoke the coals because I just put in a piece of raw food. It's not, even if I stoke the coals, it's not going to be ready till tomorrow morning. So that's why that's the heter of kedera chaisa that's quoted in the Gemara and in the Shulchan Aruch. The problem is that bisman hazeh is that really applicable. Because with our heat sources, it could be that almost everything is going to get heated by the time Shabbos starts. And that's why the Aruch Shabbos says, if it's going to get to Yad Soledisbo, once earlier, before Shabbos, then the whole heter doesn't apply. And the other poskim, the Piskei Teshuvos, the Rav Henkin discuss, we're not sure if it really is such a heter. If one has a slow cooker that really is on slow, and it's not going to get ready until tomorrow morning, for sure, then the heter would still apply. That you don't have to cover if you put in the kedera chaisa. But if it's a type of, even our crockpots, even our slow cookers, it could cook in a couple of hours to make it edible by 10, 11 o'clock at night, so then one wouldn't have this heter bisman hazeh. What is machlu ben drusoi? We mentioned it before. Chananias, that's a machlokas between Rashi and the Rambam. Rashi says machlu ben drusoi is a third cooked. Rashi daf chaf in Shabbos. The Rambam says half cooked. And we try to be machmer l'chanchila, depending what the chumrah is. How do you measure it, though, a third or a half? So the Piskei Teshuvos quote that some say, well, you go by the amount of time it takes. If it takes 3 hours to cook, so you split 3 hours into half of 3 hours is machlo bejusoy according to the Rambam, and a third for Rashi. But the problem is, the Achronim point out that for some foods, a piece of steak, the first half of the cooking, it changes less. It becomes more edible very quickly in the second half of the cooking. So it's a little tricky to be able to, go by time. Generally, we don't mess around with something is edible, not edible. We generally don't. We're machmir generally l'chol deis, and therefore here even we're machmir like the Rabbanon l'chadchila, and even according to Hananya we're machmir in terms of machlo bedrusai. So again, Shehiyah in contemporary ovens, page 137, in contemporary kitchens, ovens and crockpots and the hot plates. So inside an oven, we'll get to that second. First on top of an oven, right, on the flames. So what do you have to do? So the minhag of many, more in the days of old, but not in the days of old, but in just a number of years ago, it was more common to put a blech, to put a metal sheet on the fire, and that, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, according to most poskim, that makes it into a covered flame, and therefore you can leave something on the fire, l'chadchila, before Shabbos, even according to the Rabbanan. Right, even if it's mavushal kol tzarcho, if it's not mavushal kol tzarcho, leave it on that. And what do I cover? I cover the fire, because that's what I have to cover. That's what was covered in the days of old. But one second, the whole chash of Shehiayh, I might come to stoke. So nowadays in our ovens and our flames, we're not touching the flames, we're touching the knobs. That's how we adjust. So shall we say that, the knobs are really the ikr because, that's how we adjust things today? Rav Moshe still says the din was to cover fire, because that's how you adjusted in the days of old, covering it or cooling it off. So that's what we do. L'chadchila, cover the knobs too, if you can. That's why some blechs have a bend at the end of it. That's where Moshe says, af b'lo kisui, gam ala kaftarim, even if you don't cover, it's still okay, maker a din, but it's better to cover the knobs. Rabbi Tzion Abishol, quoted here in the Orlat Zion, says, no, the takana is the fire, so therefore just the fire, that's all you have to do. The knobs do not need to be covered. The Chazon Ish rejects the whole thing. He says a blech doesn't make it into a covered fire. He thinks that just adds the heat. It raises it up a little bit. Lo chashav kedin nasan kedira rekanas al akira lahefsik, right? The hacha lo havira kakisas akira bekisuya. He does not think that the whole blech even works, but we generally assume, like most poskim, that the blech would work. Yaakov Yosef assumes that way as well. The Menuchas Ava quotes that really the knobs are the Iker Hadin, because that's how we adjust things bizman hazeh. And Rabbi Eider quotes from Rav Color that would, if you just want to cover the knob, put tin foil on the knobs, that maker do would be enough, even though the flame is open. But we don't adjust flames by touching the flames. We do it by the knobs. So Me'ikar Hadin, that would work. Other poskim hold that maybe the fire and the knobs are both maker adin, so we have all. We have some say just the knobs, we have some say just the fire. L'chadchila the knobs, some say just the fire without l'chadchila the knobs, and some say even the knobs are l'chadchila and maker adin. That's Rav Rosner in the in source 34, the Be'er Moshe, and Rav Rosner also in the Shevet HaLevi, that's quoted in the footnote. What about, that's in terms of on fire. What about inside an oven? So that might be more chamor. Inside an oven might be chamor. First of all, if the oven is on, you have to worry about the thermostat. If it's not on a Shabbos mode, when I open the oven, cold air will go in. That will cause the oven to go on. So that's a separate issue about the oven itself. But what about putting food in? So that is leaving food in. Sorry, this is all still in Shehiayh, so leaving food in. So as long as you don't have any oven problem, how do you cover in that way? So if you want to get the chachamim l'chadchila, you have to cover the fire. How do you cover the fire? So Moshe Feinstein talks about putting in an oven insert that is covered on all four sides. That's generally not so practical. People don't have that. So that might be a case where you want to leave it before it to cover the knobs. If the oven went off, people sometimes have it on a timer and it goes off by the time you take the food out, then there's no issue. It's not on. It's not called an oven anymore if there's no more heat source, even if it's keeping it warm. But if it's still on and it's on a Shabbos mode, so then covering the knobs, or maybe if it's on a Shabbos mode and it's impossible to adjust anything unless you have to go to the computer. And so some say, as we saw, some poskim say that itself is considered covered knobs, because you'd have to do a lot of tircha in order to undo it. So that's a discussion about putting something inside an oven. So that's Shehiyah on a flame, Shehiyah in an oven. What about Shehiyah on a hot plate? So that we discussed on page 150. So most poskim assume that a hot plate is at least like a covered flame. And therefore we said, Shehiyah on a covered flame is mutter. L'chadchila, even according to the Rabbanan, Fishor Chananya, if it's machal ben drusai. That's what most assume is allowed. There are those that Rav Yashiv is machmir. He thinks that it doesn't look like anything unusual. That's why people warm things up all the time. So he assumes that lo plug rabbanan, and that's a problem. But the many say that the Shmir Shabbos and the other Yaakov Yosef also say there's no problem leaving food on a hot plate before when Shabbos starts. What about a crockpot? Same thing. L'chor would be a crockpot in terms of leaving things on that one would need to cover. What cover? So let's say the lining the inside of the crockpot and covering the knobs. That would be l'chadchila to do both in order to leave it. Again, if one doesn't cover it, as long as it's machol ben drusai me'ikar adin according to Chananya, you don't need to cover, you don't need to line it. But l'chadchila we try to pass on like the Rabbanan l'chadchila, and therefore you'd line the inside of the crockpot and cover the knobs. That would be l'chadchila. Rav Moshe says, remember, the inside is the ikar, the fire. Others say the knobs are the ikar, and others say both. That is all Shehiyah. Hachzarah, now going to part 2. Hachzarah, or as it's called in short, Chazara, but Hachzarah really means to return, to put items on heat sources on Shabbos. So that already is trickier. What is the reason for the limitation there? Why do the Rabbanan not allow you to put fully cooked food on heat sources on Shabbos? That's a machlokas rishonim. Machlokas rishonim. Rov rishonim assume, like the Rashba says, in Shabbos Daf Mem, you have it there on page 168, Mechsi kimevashel. It looks like cooking. If I put food on a heat source on Shabbos, it looks like cooking, and therefore it is also for me to do that midirabanan, putting anything on an open flame. And the Rabbeinu Tam quotes, that is also based on Shehiayh. This is also based on, you might come to stoke the coals to make it bigger in order to make your food cook faster, and both of those are taken into account lahalacha. What are the conditions of Hachzarah? Remember, we said the yesod was, as long as I could view my Hachzarah as a returning, and not what's called an asina l'chadchila, not putting something on for the first time, then it's mutter. But what are the conditions for Hachzarah to make it called a Hachzarah? So, depending on which sefer you look in, 4 conditions, 6 conditions, 5 conditions. So what are the conditions? The halacha is the halacha. The question is just how you number them. Number 1, fully cooked, mavushal kol tzarcho. That's a din daraisa. That's not a din rabbanan. If something is not fully cooked, I cannot put it on a covered flame, indirect flame. If something's not fully cooked. So number 1 condition for Hachzarah is fully cooked. If I want to take out Chulent on Friday night and put it back into the crock pot, I can have all the other conditions, but if it's not fully cooked, some of the barley is still hard, I can't put it back. So I have to check that, I have to make sure it's fully cooked. Not mavushal kol tzarcho. Like we discussed in past shiurim, there's bishul d'oraisa up until Muvushal kol tzarcho, according to what we are machmir for, Achlokas Rambam Rashba. So, number one, fully cooked. Number one. Number two is covered fire. Garfa katim. One is not allowed to put something on an open fire on Shabbos. Period. Can't put. We discussed in last year about stirring on an open fire if it's fully cooked. But what if it's not on an open fire? Putting something on an open fire on Shabbos is not allowed. That is number two. Garfa katim. Those two, there's no wiggle room for. Fully cooked in garfa katim. There's no wiggle room on those. Number three, here we have it as number three in the packet on page 170, on top and not inside. The Shulchan Aruch, based on the Gemara, talks about toch and al gaba. Putting something inside on Shabbos is much more chamor, and therefore it has to be on top. We'll talk about the examples of this. But number three on top. Number four is 4 and 5. You might put them together, and this is what we have: daito lahachzir and odan biyado. Those are the two that are put together as conditions. The Gemara in Shabbos Lamed Ches quotes both of these conditions. The question is, how do you read it? It's two deyas in the Gemara, two Ikita Amris, about what the maskana is. Do you need both? Do you need one? Halacha lamaisa. The Rishonim discuss what is needed lamaisa. The Rush quotes Avdina lechumra. Lechumra meaning you need, when you take off a heat source on Shabbos, you have to have das that you're going to put it back on the heat source, and you have to still hold it in your hand. Daito and odan biyado. Why? Because if you're missing either of those, that breaks your putting it back, and therefore it would be called, if you would put it back, it would be called an asina l'chadchila. It wouldn't be called a Hachzarah. And therefore, the Rishonim say that's why you need these conditions. The Rambam, interestingly, does not mention daito lahachzir at all. The Rambam in Hilchot Shabbos just mentions, you have it there in source 14, you put it on the ground, that's a problem. You can't put it on the ground. So he doesn't mention daito lahachzir. The Beis Yosef wonders why the Rambam paskins like that day of the Gemara without daito lahachzir. But in any case, which days does the Shulchan Aruch quote? So the Shulchan Aruch says in Reish and Gimel Beis, you have it there in Surah 17, Garaf Katum, Mavushal Kol Tzarcho. Remember those two, there's no getting out of. And the Ramah quotes Oda Biyado. The Shulchan Aruch just says you can't put it on the ground. Oda Biyado. The Ramah quotes daito lahachzir. Daito lahachzir. According to the Shulchan Aruch, it sounds like as long as it's covered, you didn't put it on the floor. The Ramah adds in daito lahachzir and odam biyado. The Mishnah Berurah says that bishas tzorech mamish, if you have one or the other, daito lahachzir or odam biyado. Let's say it's a very heavy pot, so you can't. I'm sorry, let's take it back for a second. You didn't have das to put it back. You thought it was going to be for Friday night. Then your wife says, no, you have to put it back. So you didn't have daito. That's already toos. That's an even bigger heter. But even if you didn't have daito lahachzir, nothing changed. You're allowed to put it back as long as it's oda biyado. And also, if it's oda biyado, if you have daito lahachzir, even if it's not oda biyado, as I said, if it's a very heavy pot, you're going to put it down. The best is to have two people there, and you have one person holding the handle the whole time while you're serving it. Then you put it back. But if not, b'diavad, missing one or the other is okay. Missing both of them is more difficult. If you don't have daito lahachzir and you don't have odem biyado, it's a problem. What about putting it on the counter? So l'chora, that's somewhere in between. The Gemara has a suffix like that. It's not the same as the ground. It's not the same as in your hand. It's somewhere in the middle. So we assume counter, often you put it down with in mind to put it back. So l'chora, that would be okay if one needs to put it back. So these are the conditions. There is a big kula, which means if I take something out from the refrigerator on Shabbos morning, I cannot put it on a covered fire on Shabbos morning because I'm missing the conditions. Daito lahachzir, oden biyado. I'm missing those. Even if it's mavushal kol tzarcho, even if it's a covered fire, you can't just take it out of the fridge on Shabbos morning, and that's what we assume. There are other ways to warm things up, which we will by the time get to. But there is a heter of the Ran. We mentioned this Ran, some source 23, and this Ran is quoted in the Ramah. And we generally try not to rely. We don't rely on this Ran l'chadchila, but if one is in a house and one relies on this Ran, definitely it is yesh makom, yesh miyama lismoch. What does the Ran say? If the food was on the fire when Shabbos started, then you can put it back. Then you don't need daito lahachzir and odem biyado. It has to be there. If it wasn't on the flame when Shabbos started, you don't have this Ran. But the Ran's heter is if it was on the fire on Shabbos, when Shabbos started. And then, I don't know, you used it Friday night, then you want to put it back on Shabbos morning, that is allowed, because that's considered a Hachzarah. Eino aser elak shenitlo menakir mibod yom. V'lo achzira shechashecha. Avam lachu misham mishechashecha. Afilo nichal gavi karka. It would be mutter. So generally, we don't rely on this Ran unless it is a difficult situation, shasat chak, or like I mentioned before, if you took it off by mistake, that also you can rely on the Ran. Fine. So what about Lamaisa in modern cases, modern ovens? So what about inside an oven? We mentioned last time, according to most poskim, we mentioned earlier in this year, most poskim, an oven is not called gorfa katem. Ramosha says you have to put an insert, and that's also called toch, right, to put it on. So generally we try not to put things inside ovens on Shabbos day into real ovens. What about warming drawers? With Rabbi Shalom, we'll get to that a little bit later. But there is another way. So how do you warm up stuff on Shabbos morning? Right, if you can't take it out of the fridge. So that's based on a steer in Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch in Reish Nun Gimel, you have it there in source number 30, says you could turn over a pot. You could turn over a pot on a fire and put food on top of that pot. Put one pot on top of the other pot. That's called kedera agabe kedera. That's also mutter, even if it's on an open fire. Why is that mutter? It's better than just a covered fire because it's raised up. It's not just a covered fire, a cover on a fire. You have a pot, and then you put something on top of that pot. That's called kedera agabe kedera. So that seems to be mutter in Reish Nun Gimel, but it seems like you need the conditions of Hachzarah. But if you look in the Shulchan Aruch elsewhere, Reish Nun Gimel, that was Reish Nun Gimel Gimel. If you look in Reish Nun Gimel Hey, he seems to say that you could put it on a pot even if you don't have the conditions, meaning taking it out of the refrigerator in the morning. So do you need the conditions or not? So the Bir Halacha quotes the Pri Megadim. That's the chiluk that we assume la halacha. Bir Halacha in 35. That it depends if the bottom pot is full or not. If the bottom pot is empty, then it's just like a covered fire. Then you need the conditions of Hachzarah. If the bottom pot is full, then you could it's full of food. Then you can put it on top of that pot. That's the heter of kedera gabe kedera, and that's not called Hachzarah. Why? The lumdus is the Chazon Ish says that the top pot is getting cooked by the bottom food. It's not getting cooked by the fire. And therefore, that there's no mechzik mavashel in that case. And therefore, taking food out of a fridge, putting it on top of a crock pot, on top of an urn, that's all mutter. That's all mutter, again, as long as it's not liquid, as we said in past shiurim. So what about putting it directly on a hot plate? What about taking food and putting it directly on a hot plate? So a hot plate doesn't have any knobs. So is that called a covered fire? Is that better than so again, turning over a pot on top of a hot plate and then putting something on top of that. So that's would that be like putting it on a covered flame? Would that be the Aruch HaShabbos rules lechumra like the Chazon Ish that you cannot put it on directly on a hot plate? You have to put it on top of a pot of food. Right? Like we said, the bottom pot has to be full. But the Shmir Shabbos says that you don't need a pot there. It's like a covered fire, and therefore, as long as you have the conditions, right? The Shmir Shabbos says in 39. Plata chashmalit hamiyuchedes l'Shabbos, hamiyuchedes l'shmar achol ma'achal, ve'ein regilam lavashel aleha. You don't usually cook on that, and it's impossible. There are no adjustments. It doesn't need another kisui. That's considered a covered fire, the hot plate, and therefore, as long as you have the other conditions, then it's okay. Or there's another heter I didn't mention again, a Chazara. If you have a covered fire and then you put an upside down pot, so that's good enough for kedera gabe kedera. Then the bottom pot could be empty. So a hot plate is considered a covered fire. So if you want to turn over a pot and put stuff directly on there, even if the bottom pot is empty, it's mutter according to the Shmir Shabbos. There is an even stronger heter that one might say that maybe you could put it directly on the hot plate because maybe the hot plate is only it's even better than a covered fire. Why? Because it's not meant to cook. People don't cook on a hot plate. They just warm things up on a hot plate. Number two, it's impossible to adjust. There's no adjustments. You just plug it in. There's nothing to adjust. So in a footnote, he quotes that svara from Rav Shalom Zalman and Rabbi Willig paskins that way. And it could be that Rav Moshe paskins that way. It's a question, what does Rav Moshe mean? When Rav Moshe says, Efshar lis basel sham, does he mean it's not the derech to be misbashel? So there's a question about what Rav Moshe means. We saw from Rav Feinstein, Rabbi Eider. So there are those that say that you can put stuff directly on a hot plate Shabbos morning because it's better than a covered fire. The Shmiras Shabbos does not think so. He thinks it is a covered fire, and therefore you can only put stuff on a hot plate on top of an empty pot. That's in terms of hot plates. What about warming drawers? So, again, the warming drawers, first of all, you have to make sure there's no issue with the warming drawer itself, with the thermostat. That's discussed in an article that we saw from the Star K. Rabbi Willig and others, and some poskim of the CRC, felt like a warming drawer could be used even if it reaches higher than Yasser Ledisbo, but you have to cover the knobs. You have to cover because people don't cook in a warming drawer. You have to cover. You have to have some tinfoil sticking out. Others say that they're not into warming drawers at all because it's like toch for Hachzarah. So you have to know there's machlokas about that. What about a case of Hachzarah that comes up? Let's say my Chulent is burning, and I want to add water to the Chulent. So what do I do? So if the Chulent is in it, it's not the crockpot is not lined, so then that could be an issue. That is an issue because that's an open flame according to most. I didn't mention again, there's a big header of Rav Ovadia. The Meir of Ovadia says that there's in between the heating element and the top of the hot plate and the heating element and the metal of the crockpot, maybe there's a little space. So it's already called Kdera Gavik Dera. We don't generally assume like that's such a kula, but in this case, generally when I want to return to a crock pot, like we said, you have to line the whole inside of the crock pot, cover the knobs, and take it out and put it back in. As long as you have the other conditions of Mevushal Kol Tzarcho, covered fire, Oda Biyado, Daito Lahachsi, you try to have all of those conditions. But what happens if my Chulent is burning? So I want to put water in. So the best thing to do is to pick it up, go under the urn. The water should go straight into the pot, so it's already fully cooked. So it's not bishul daraisa. I stir it when it's off the fire, so I'm not violating the kolbo, like we said a few weeks ago about stirring when it's on the fire. And then I can put it back on, cover it, and then put it back onto in the crock pot, which is lined. So I'm going from one fire, I'm putting it onto a covered fire. So that's fine. I'm returning it to a different covered fire, but it's okay. Different covered fire is also okay. If that can't be done, then there is a kula to put it in Kli Sheni and then put it directly in. If there's no way just to get the insert under the under the urn, so one can put it in a Kli Sheni also and then move it. That's what Rav Ribiat says on page 199. One may add water to the pot even from a Kli Sheni if that's what is needed. What about a timer? Having a timer warm up cold food on Shabbos morning? So there are those that quote a kula, but generally we are don't assume that is mutter. So that's Hachzarah. And what about Hatmana? The third, insulation. So insulation, it's asur d'Rabbanan to insulate fully cooked food before Shabbos, only in a situation that's called B'davar HaMosef Hevel, in something that will add. Heat is still being added to the food, and on Shabbos it's asur even for a davar she'eino mosef hevel, even for something that doesn't add heat, just insulation itself on a heat source that contains the heat. What's the reasons for this? So we did the whole background of whether the issue is I might come to stoke the coals, I might come to other chashos. The Orcha Shabbos summarizes this in source number 10. Hatmana is I totally insulate, I wrap something in some type of cover, and Isser Hatmana B'davar HaMosef Hevel, something that adds heat, that's Asur, because Shema Yat Min Beremet Sheish B'Kacheles, I might come to put it on coals, and I might come to stoke the coals. And on Shabbos, only by a davar that retains the heat. So Lamaisa, that's the background for Hatmana. We're not going to review that, but review the Lamaisa cases. The rules and regulations for Hatmana. Number one, Hatmana is only if I'm daito lahatmin. That's my kavana. There's no psik reisha by this isur d'Rabbanan. Only if I have kavana to insulate in order to be able to cook it properly and keep the heat, that's when it is mutter. But let's say I'm wrapping up something in order just to so it doesn't fall apart. I want to warm up schnitzel on Shabbos morning. I'll wrap it in tin foil to be able to put it on the crock pot. So that's fine. That's mutter because I wrapped it because first of all that's the kli itself. I'm not wrapping it in the kli. That's just holding it. Number two, I just want to hold it. I don't want to insulate it. We saw that if you put a double wrapping of aluminum foil, so the second one is l'chora meant for the heating purposes, and therefore that would be a problem. But number one, you need das for insulation. Number two, it has to be totally insulated. What does totally insulated mean? What if it's not fully insulated? For example, Rabbi Hananel, source 13. What if it's sitting in coals? So the coals are only around, it's sitting in the coals, it's around the pot, but the whole top of the pot is still not covered. Rabbeinu Chananel says that's still usher. Hatmana b'mixas, shma hatmana. And Rabbeinu Tam is Meiko. Rabbeinu Tam says no. No, hatmana means fully insulated. Fully insulated. The Shulchan Aruch quotes, hatmana gabe gechalim is usher. Right? Even just a partial hatmana is usher. The Pri Megadim and others assume that, you know, the Ramah quotes the kula al kol machu magula lamala. It is lo mikri hatmana. As long as it is revealed on top, it's not hatmana. What does revealed mean? Does it mean pashtus, even the top? It could be covered, the whole pot could be in the coals, but as long as the top is not covered, it's not called hatmana. Others say maybe it has to be some of the walls that have to be open, but this is a big issue. The Chazon does not like the whole heter of the Ramah based on Rabbeinu Tam, but Meikar Adin, the Ramah says it, and the Shmir Shabbos paskins that way, that as long as it's not fully covered, it is a mutter. The Shulchan Aruch Harav quotes a kula even for Sfardim that maybe the whole only chumrah of magula b'mixas of hadmana b'mixas is only by a davar hamosef hevel. But if a davar she'ena mosef hevel, maybe they would be makel even regarding that. That's a big kula. There's a big chumrah also that the Mamar Mordechai quotes that even putting food on a hot plate, wrapping it on a hot plate, directly from Erev Shabbos is based on Hatmana, because the hot plate is like the coals that you're putting it on. Other poskim say, no, the coals is because it's sunk into the coals and it's surrounding it. The hot plate is not surrounding, but the Mamar Mordechai, or Mordechai Leo, is machmir regarding that. What other requirements for Hatmana? We said it has to be direct contact. If there's any space in between, I wrap it in a towel, but there's space under the towel, so that is still, that is not a problem of hatmana. That's why there's no hatmana in an oven. We didn't talk about hatmana in an oven because there's a lot of air space there. It has to be wrapped tightly in a towel and on a heat source that either adds heat or contains the heat. So what about hatmana on a hot plate before Shabbos? Hatmana, not just putting on a hot plate without wrapping it. What if you're wrapping it? That's usher. Because, as we learned, the heat source doesn't have to be the insulating elements. Like the towel doesn't have to be giving off the heat. Even if you have the fire underneath, which is separate, and you have the insulating elements around, that is also called hatmana. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says in source 28. That's still going to be called hatmana. We assume that is an issue of hatmana, but again, only if it's wrapped. If it's just put on the hot plate without wrapping, that for sure is not an issue of hatmana. Hatmana is only in a kli rishon, right? Hatmana in a kli sheni is not called hatmana, right? That is what the Gemara says in Shabbos Nun Aleph, that we have this on page 232, right? If you put it in a kli sheni, and that's why, let's say, a thermos. If you pour something into a thermos is a kli sheni. So a thermos itself, the Chazon Ish talks about this, itself is not a problem of hatmana because it's all one kli. But if you want to say a thermos is like a kli inside a kli, there's no problem because it's a kli sheni, and the gzeira was only by a kli rishon, not by a kli sheni. What about hatmana of ochel betoch ochel? We discussed that also. That's a major machlokas achronim. The Mishnah Berurah discusses, I'm going to wrap up kishka in tinfoil and submerge it totally into the chulent. So is that a problem? So the Mishnah Berurah seems to say it's a problem. Talk about submerging water or some other type of item. If I just put the kishka in, not being wrapped, that's not called hatmana in food. The whole thing is chulent. But if I wrap it totally, that could be a problem. So how could one get out of this? Number one, poke some holes in it, so it's only hatmana b'mixas. Number two, have some of it sticking out on top. Hatmana b'mixas. Or number three, others say the whole thing is not hatmana. Because hatmana is only about, remember, you wrap it in order to, the reason you're wrapping it is because you want it to be insulated and get hot from what's underneath. But even if that's part of your kavanah, but if your kavanah is because you don't want it to fall apart, you want to serve the chulent, you want to serve the kishka separately, right? You don't want it to whatever other reasons, so then it's not going to be an isser of hatmana. So again, that's a question in the poskim, whether that is an issue or not. What about a crockpot? So this was Rav Shlomo Zalman's last psak. If you remember, we mentioned that. A crockpot. Is there a problem of hatmana in a crockpot? So remember, we line the inside of the crockpot because of Shehiyah purposes and Hachzarah purposes. We cover the knobs. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, but there's hatmana. and it's wrapped inside, and even there's a tiny little space in between because the pot goes a little in, concave, convex, I don't remember which one it is, but it goes in, so there's a little space there, but you can't see that space. Shlomo Zalman says it's a problem of Hatmana, and therefore you have to lift up the pot a little bit. Put some rocks or some folded up tin foils on the bottom to lift it up so there's some space, so it's not Hatmana. Other poskim say, no, there's no Hatmana there. First of all, Megula Lamala, the whole cover of the crock pot is not covered. You have the cover on, but insulation requires to cover that, right? So therefore, there's no issue. Number two, it might be the space. There is some space in between. This is a member of the Shehiayh Alevi's makeup, but this is known as Rav Shlomo Zalman's last psak, one of the major controversies. But again, a crock pot you should use on Shabbos. We should have good food on Shabbos, like the Balamor says. If we don't have hot food on Shabbos, Shema Pikarasu, right? Because maybe we're like at Stuki. Hot food on Shabbos is great. Oneg Shabbos. We just have to know how to do it, fulfilling these halachas of Shehiyah, Hachzarah, and Hatmana. So this takes us through the review of Hilchot Shabbos Bishul. By the Shem, next time we'll try to review one more, Dash and Schita, the other two shiurim in this volume number 18. Okay, we'll stop here.